welcome to the Race Matters class offered through Rhine University. I am Tunay Oguz, and I am an associate professor of economics at Rhine. And this week, we will use an economics lens to examine the connections between race and wealth inequality in the United States. This is a topic of interest to researchers and policymakers, and public awareness of these issues is growing. This presentation will be an overview of recent research with the goal of helping you develop a foundational understanding of how race contributes to the ability to build wealth. I will also provide my list of resources at the end of this presentation if you want to explore this topic further. So first of all, in this presentation, we will be discussing the wealth gap between Black and white Americans that has been a part of American life for many decades. As part of the larger picture, we will explore how redlining and racial discrimination have largely excluded minorities from home ownership throughout the United States. We will also discuss how income inequality contributes to this persistent gap. The fact that these inequalities have persisted over time without significant improvement. And this is an issue of social and racial justice that needs attention if we are to create a more fair society. So I want to start with giving a brief overview of these issues and their extent throughout the population. And I will present a series of charts from various sources that illustrate wide range in wealth outcomes within the United States. And finally, we will explore the systemic mechanisms and public policy decisions that contribute to these gaps. But before doing that, let's start by defining a few terms that you are likely familiar with, but maybe you haven't considered in the context of inequality. First, let's start with income. Your income is the flow of money that you receive for your work. Most people exchange their time for money in a job or as part of their business. So this is your hourly wage or salary. It is very important to distinguish between income and wealth. The simplest definition of wealth is your assets minus your debt, which is essentially your net worth. Wealth is the investments or other assets a person accumulates during their life. This can include real estate, stocks, bonds, or fine art. It is created over time and it can grow through what is known as compounding. Unlike exchanging your time for wages, wealth is transferable. This is important because families work to build wealth and participate in intergenerational wealth transfer, which is moving assets from one generation to the next. As you can see, wealth is different than income because it's based not only on receiving income, but also on your ability to accumulate assets, including receiving assets from others. So let's look at the wealth distribution. And this chart is from a study published at Federal Reserve by Kent and Rickards. And it shows the wealth distribution in the United States in 2019. As you can see, 12.9 million families in the United States own 76% of the overall wealth. That number represents just 10% of the population. So 10% of the population own 76% of the overall wealth. The bottom 50%, or almost like 64 million families, own just 1% of the overall wealth. So to compare the racial composition of this wealth gap, we need to look at what percentage of Black and white families fall within the top and bottom of wealth ownership. And again, according to the Federal Reserve, 13% of white families in the United States fall within the top 10%, while only 1% of Black families did. 75% of Black families are in the bottom 50%, compared to just 41% of white families. So now let's look at some specific numbers that break down the wealth gap between Black and white families. So this graph is based on the Survey of Consumer Finances conducted by, again, the Federal Reserve Board every 3 years. As you can see from the chart, the gap in wealth is significant and persistent beyond comparing gains and losses. This chart reveals the enormity of the difference between US household wealth based on race. In 2019, 50% of white families had less than $184,000, and 50% of Black families had less than $23,000. According to the survey, the majority, or 82% of Black families, had less wealth than the typical median white family. So what does it mean? What does it mean that Black families had less wealth than typical median white family? What this means is that Black families lag behind white families to a significant degree in terms of accumulated wealth. The extent of the wealth gap, as measured in 2019, showed that Black families had only 12 cents for every dollar of household wealth that white families had. I'm going to repeat that. Black families had only 12 cents for every dollar of household wealth that white families had. In addition, although making up 15% of total households in the United States, Black households held just 3% of total household wealth in 2019. Conversely, white families had held 85% of total household wealth, despite making up just 66% of the total households. Next, let's look at some of the socioeconomic factors that contribute to this gap. So researchers actually have tried to identify the socioeconomic factors that have led to this gap and why the gap is chronic. For example, there's a highly cited study by Shapiro, Mesquite, and Osoro at the Institute of Assets and Social Policy found 5 main contributing factors listed in this chart. Number of years of home ownership, household income, unemployment, college education, and financial support, or you can call it inheritance. As you can see in the chart, the years you have owned your home is the largest contributor to the wealth gap, exceeding household income and educational level, which are both impacted by the neighborhood where your house is located. So let's look at some more statistics to help you understand these socioeconomic factors and how they differ between Black and white households. Let's start with the home ownership. Owning a home is a major way families build wealth. So it is important to look at disparities in home ownership. In this chart from the Federal Reserve, based on 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances, the blue column represents white family home ownership, and the orange one represents Black family home ownership at 3 different life stages. For families with a head of household under the age of 35, around 46% of white families own their home, compared to just 17% of Black families. This gap does narrow as families age, with Black families at 51% of home ownership by the time they reach the middle age, compared to 73% of middle-aged white families. but that delay has consequences for wealth accumulation, and it doesn't take into account the comparative home values. According to the Federal Reserve, there are also significant gaps in home values among home buyers by race and ethnicity. The average value of a white family's home is $230,000, while the average home value of Black families is about $150,000. So some researchers have found that this gap may be related to the differences in the wealth of homeowners' parents. For instance, in 2002, Charles and Hurst found that Black families are far less likely than white families to get help with their down payments from their parents. So this means that Black families delay having a house to buy a house because they don't receive inheritance from their parents. According to the Brookings Institute in 2019, 30% of white households in the United States received an average of inheritance of nearly $200,000, while only 1 in 10 Black households did, and the average inheritance was $100,000 for them. So as a result, the likelihood of receiving an inheritance and the size of that inheritance also contributes to the racial wealth gap, and the effects are felt in multiple generations of the same family. So these differences also extend to income, which is important because the income stream of a family is related to their ability to accumulate wealth. This chart from the Economic Policy Institute represents real household income by race and ethnicity from 2000 to 2019. And white household income is represented by the green line and Black household income by the blue line. As you can see, the income gap between these two groups is persistent and wide. And this chart shows that in 2019, the median Black household earned just 61 cents for every dollar of income the median white household earned. Even among college graduates, racial income inequality between whites and Blacks persists, with whites out-earning their Black counterparts who hold the same degree, and Black graduates on average carry more student loan debt beyond college than their white counterparts. So in this presentation, we explored the persistent wealth gap between white and Black families in the United States, including some of the socioeconomic factors that disadvantage Black families and contribute to this gap. In the next presentation, we are going to look more closely at how long-standing practices controlling home ownership and home value, along with other factors, disadvantage Black families and harm their ability to accumulate wealth. So these are my resources for the charts that I listed here. So please don't hesitate to look at these references and let me know if you have any questions.